Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We are back for another deck tech. I'm your host, Ryu Spectre, and today I want to show you a deck that I've actually been working on for quite some time. This is a modern blue-white control deck that revolves around two of my favorite cards ever. And ironically enough, they both have the word Sphinx in the name of them. But yeah, the reason I wanted to build a deck like this was because I played a lot of Standard with Sphinx's Revelation and a little bit of Standard with Sphinx's Tutelage, and I really like both these cards, and they're really fun to play with. And I figured, since these cards aren't going to be legal in Standard forever, I want to play a modern deck with them. And so I figured, even though, as of filming this, Sphinx's Tutelage, technically speaking, is still in Standard at the moment, but I figured, let's make a modern deck with them. They're really awesome cards, and they're really powerful. If you've ever played with either of these cards, I'm sure you know how great they are and how effective they are at doing what they do. So I figured I'd share this deck because it's technically speaking a rogue control deck, and it's a really fun deck to play. So let's go into a bit better detail of what this deck does and how it works. The first thing we're going to cover is the core of the deck, which is of course made of the two cards with Sphinxes in their name, Sphinx's Tutelage and Sphinx's Revelation. Like I say, these were some of my favorite cards to play in Standard, and I wanted to make a control deck in Modern with them. My copies of Sphinx's Tutelage are in Chinese, but in case you don't know what they do, it's an enchantment for 2 and a blue, and whenever I draw a card, I can have target opponent put the top 2 cards of their library into his or her graveyard, and if those 2 cards share a color, I get to repeat this process until one of them does not. It also has an activated ability of 5 and 1 blue mana, of which I can draw a card, and therefore trigger its ability, and discard a card after that. Sphinx's Revelation, of course, caused several headaches, and while it wasn't Standard, is an instant for X, white, and 2 blues, draw X cards, gain X life, and if you have a ton of mana, you can get tons of triggered abilities off of the Sphinx's Tutelage. From my playing experience, it's actually quite nice to actually get Sphinx's Tutelage a bit later when you have some support spells or counter spells or removal to stabilize alongside of it, and then cast Sphinx's Revelation the turn or two after when you have a large sum of lands, and this way you'll really get a bigger payoff off of your Sphinx's Tutelage. It's also worth noting that the unbanned card, Ancestral Visions, is actually really good in this deck, although I probably wouldn't advise playing a full set of them just because they make really lousy top decks. I would probably be running some, but I don't have any, which is really awkward. Up next, we have a plethora of cards that somewhat hinder early game aggression and give us cards in the process. Starting on the left here, we have Wall of Omens, which is a great blocker for 2 mana, and it gives us a card. If we have a Tutelage in play, it can give us more value from that. Next on the right, we have our set of Remands. Just like Wall of Omens, Remand does exactly what we want it to do. It's an argument that Remand's kind of iffy in a deck like this because we're not trying to combo off or win as fast as we can. This is a very synergy-based deck of drawing cards and milling your opponent. But it's a really effective card. Oddly enough, we run a lot of counter spells in addition to that, and more often than not, Remand will get us into the hard counters that we do want to see. Speaking of which, we have a full set of Cryptic Commands, which, well, pretty much do exactly what we want it to do. It just gives us a card. As you can see, there's kind of a theme here with everyone getting us more cards. Although it's not technically card advantage, it does get us doing what the deck wants to do, and that is drawing more cards and getting more potential triggers off of Sphinx's Tutelage. There's also one Oshitize command in there, just for some life gain and card draw, but hey, at times you will occasionally bring back a Wall of Omens, or you'll be countering a Tarmogoyf. It's also important to note that you know that your metagame has a lot of decks that use Abrupt Decay. Rather than Wall of Omens, you may actually want to try Spellskite, because it actually diverges Abrupt Decay to it, and it, saves your Sphinx's Tutelage from getting destroyed. Up next, we have a plethora of, I guess you could say, supporter spells and various spot removal, board wipes, and counter spells meant to deal with all sorts of scenarios and situations. As you see on the top left there, we have our full set of Path to Exile. Considering it's White's most efficient removal in format, we kind of have to run a set. Gets rid of early game aggro and any other creature that you severely dislike, and it can also be used to exile your own creatures like your Wall of Omens that you don't feel like you need anymore to get more mana to power your Sphinx's Revelation. We run one copy of Logic Knot. We don't run that many fetch lands, so Logic Knot's not as good as it could potentially be. But still, we kind of like to have another hard counter in addition to the cryptic commands. I know you might be arguing with me that, hey, Logic Knot's not a hard counter. Well, more than often than not, it usually is, and especially in this deck, considering we're cantripping, chaining into all these cards, and it really gets the ball rolling. One Spell Snare, although some people would probably want to run more depending on the meta. I like to run one. There actually are a lot of cards in this deck that are only good in various scenarios, and it's nice that Sphinx's Tutelage has the activated ability to draw a card and discard a card. That way you can pitch what you don't need and draw potentially something that you do. Spell Snare is a good card overall, but like I said before, if you've been watching my videos, Spell Snare has a lot of awkward scenarios where it isn't always good against a particular matchup. One Negate, just to be sure that we have another 2-mana counterspell that hits a variety of targets. It's not great in every matchup, but it's nice at stopping things like burn and nasty combo pieces. To help us stabilize a bit better against swarm decks and decks that are reliant on a lot of creatures, we run 2 Supreme Verdicts. Some people may want to run 1, but I like to run 2 just in case. Like I say, if you don't need it, you can always discard it from the Sphinx's Tutelage and get something that may be worthwhile for you. 1 copy of Jace Beleren, just for additional triggers off of Sphinx's Tutelage and potential decoy to divert away from your life total. 1 copy of Detention Sphere, just to be sure we get rid of nasty things that are a little bit unexpected, like Planeswalkers, bigger creatures, various things that can't be hit by Path to Exile. 1 Snapcaster Mage, just to be sure that we kind of have a bit more flexibility in our deck. It's just there when we need it. We can run more if you want, but I think 1 is usually enough. This deck doesn't rely on damage, so it doesn't really need too many creatures with power. And honestly, it's just there for additional value in case we need another path or a counterspell back. And it's very flexible. We can also get it back with Ostracized Command, which is nifty. And it's just a solid way to round out the removal package. And finally, we have 1 Elixir of Immortality, which is there to give us some life. I know it might seem a little counterintuitive with things like Logic Knot and Snapcaster Mage here, but it's actually really nice considering in a lot of matches we're going to be up against the clock of a damage clock of some sorts, and it can really be nice to stabilize and get all your cards back. And plus we're drawing a lot of cards anyway, and who doesn't love to cycle their Sphinx's Revelations? It may not be that great in every matchup, but it definitely has its purpose in this deck. Next up we have the Mana Base, and it's kind of not what you may expect to see in a modern deck, but it's still a really efficient Mana Base. Because we need to power up these large Sphinx's Revelations, we need to run a lot of land. There's a total of 26 lands here. Up at the top we have our second win condition. At the top right there we have 4 copies of Celestial Colonnade, which if we can't get the tutelage going, we can roll in with our Colonnade and hopefully protect it with removal, counterspells, whatnot, what we need to get through. To the left here, we have 4 copies of Tectonic Edge, just to get rid of nasty lands, tons of man lands in the format. Nifty to have, and we, oddly enough, run a lot of blue sources to power our blue spells. A lot of spells in the deck require double blue. So having these Tech Edges here is pretty good. You might be able to get away with playing 3, or you may want to prefer playing Ghost Quarter if you know you go up against a lot of decks that can function with 3 or less lands. But still solid. And rounding out the lands here on the left, the top left at least, is our set of Flooded Strands, just to thin out our deck a little more. There's a ton of targets, as you can see. There's Hallowed Founts here. We run one Prairie Stream, just for a little bit of variety. Next to it is a Temple of Enlightenment, just for an additional Scry. Scrying can be nice, and I only run 1. It may seem kind of silly, but it's actually quite effective. It's helped me out quite a bit. And just for a little bit more value, we have some nice buddy lands here, the Glacial Fortress. They come into play untapped if I control an island or plains, and I got tons of those. As you see on the bottom, I have 6 basic islands and 2 basic plains. This may seem like a lot of basics, but I actually like to have this many basics just because of things like Blood Moon. Moving on to sideboard options, the cards you see in front of you are not the sideboard, to be honest. The sideboard, for me, has constantly changed over time. These are some of the cards I have used in the past. Just to give you an idea, all these cards are great, but you just have to keep in mind the best options for your sideboard determine the meta that you play in and aren't necessarily broad across the whole spectrum of cards. Just to go over everything, we have in the top left for the white cards is Hallowed Moonlight, good against things like Collective Company, Court of Calling, any deck that uses that. It's actually even good against Living End or any Reanimator deck, which is pretty sweet. For Affinity, we have Stony Silence. We can also use Disenchant if you know you go up against a lot of decks with artifacts and enchantments. In the middle, we have some life gain cards, Timely Reinforcements and Rest for the Weary. Both are really nice. I feel like Rest is better if you know you go up against a more Burny deck, and Timely is better if you know you go up against a more creature-heavy or Swarm deck. Against Red and Black, we have Celestial Purge, a nice efficient removal spell that hits a lot of targets, even hits Planeswalkers. And finally, on the right at the top there, we have a Rest in Peace. If you know you go up against a lot of graveyard synergistic decks, you may want to take out Snapcaster Mages or not play them in general if you are going to be playing them, which is just something you want to keep your head up because it does exile your graveyard too. I know I mentioned earlier that you may want to consider playing Spellskite in the main if you know a lot of things are going to be targeting your tutelages. The thing is, if you know it is not, they make wonderful sideboard cards, great blockers, and great way to divert other spells. If you know you go up against more creatures or creature-based decks, you may want to try another Supreme Verdict. And if you know you may need it, or if it's been working out for you, another Ojutai's Command is always nifty. Down at the bottom here we have the blue cards, or blue and hybrid cards, as we have a Shadow of Doubt here. Shadow of Doubt here is awesome because, like Hallowed Moonlight, it is very synergistic with tutelage as you get a card off of it. It's also really good against things like Court of Calling or any deck that you know relies on tutors to function. In addition to that, we also have Spreading Seas, which is also very synergistic with the tutelage. Just a great card against multicolor decks or any deck that you know runs really troublesome lands. Against other aggressive decks or green or red decks, you have Flash Freeze. There are several annoying green and red spells in the format. I'm sure you'll think of something you want to counter, and Flash Freeze is a great efficient counter. If you know you play Counterspell Wars, you may want to consider Dispel. I know I have a Dissolve here. The reason I have it here is just because you may want to bring another hard counter. It doesn't necessarily have to be Dissolve, but it's always nice because there are a lot of decks in Modern that rely on really nasty combos, and you may want to consider having a Counterspell for backup that will just counter anything. And finally, we have a neat piece of tech here. This Telemann Performance is kind of synergistic with the mill theme of our deck, but it's also nice against decks that, you know, only run one creature or very few creatures, or if you know they run big creatures like Emrakul or Ulamog or something like that. Also, don't forget about Leyline of Sanctity. That card's really good too. That was the deck. This is, like I said, this is a rogue control deck. It's a very slow deck. It doesn't win very fast. Like I said, this deck is absolutely wonderful if you missed playing Sphinx's Revelation in Standard or just love Sphinx's Revelation in general. It's a lot of fun. You draw tons of cards, and it's just a really exciting deck to play. I don't really recommend this deck if you go up against a lot of other control decks or probably not so much Tron. If you know you have a lot of combo decks, this deck can be okay, but you have to keep in mind that you do need some counter spells or some other way to neutralize the combo before you can get out your win conditions. Again, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to let me know what you think of the deck or any suggestions for the deck in the comment section below. Again, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Ryu Spectre, and I'll see you all next time.